For decades, Americans were told the Cold War was a standoff of weapons, missiles, and armies, that it was decided by nuclear stockpiles, by presidents, by treaties signed behind closed doors. But that story is incomplete, because the most decisive battles of the Cold War were never fought with bombs. They were fought with ideas, with patience, with silence. While the world watched tanks, parades, and speeches, a quieter war was unfolding, one where power was measured not by fear, but by belief. This is not the story of how the Soviet Union was attacked. This is the story of how it collapsed from within, how the CIA learned to play a longer game than the KGB ever understood, how control mistook silence for loyalty, and how freedom, slow, chaotic, and imperfect, proved impossible to defeat. This is the story of how the KGB lost the Cold War, without realizing it had already lost. As years passed, the consequences of these structural differences became impossible to ignore. Before the Cold War became a geopolitical struggle, before it became a nuclear standoff, before it became a contest of armies and missiles, it was something far older, far deeper, and far more dangerous. It was a war over how reality itself should be defined. The Soviet Union did not emerge from World War II merely victorious. It emerged traumatized, paranoid, and convinced that survival required total control. More than 20 million Soviet citizens were dead. Entire regions were flattened. Families were erased. To Soviet leadership, chaos was not theoretical. It was memory, and from that memory came a belief that shaped everything that followed. If reality is not controlled, it will destroy the state. This belief did not belong to Stalin alone. It was institutional. It was inherited. The KGB did not invent this worldview. It inherited it directly from the Cheka, the OGPU, and the NKVD, organizations forged in civil war, famine, and purges. From the very beginning, Soviet intelligence was not defensive. It was existential. Its mission was not to protect the state from enemies. Its mission was to decide who counted as an enemy. And in that system, ambiguity itself was treason. A loyal citizen was not someone who believed. A loyal citizen was someone who did not question. Silence was acceptable. Curiosity was not. By the time the KGB was formally established in 1954, this philosophy had hardened into doctrine. New officers were not trained primarily as analysts. They were trained as enforcers of certainty. They studied psychology, but not empathy. They studied fear. How long can a man remain isolated before he breaks? How much pressure causes self-censorship? How quickly does fear spread socially? These were not academic exercises. They were operational questions. The KGB understood society as a machine, and every machine required lubrication and pressure. Too little pressure and people begin to think. Too much pressure and the system begins to crack. The challenge was finding the perfect balance. And for decades, the KGB believed it had succeeded. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Soviet Union appeared monolithic. Opposition parties were non-existent. Independent media was eradicated. Religion was suppressed. Education was centralized. To the outside world, the system looked stable. But to the CIA, studying defectors, refugees, intercepted communications, something else was becoming visible. The silence was not loyalty. It was exhaustion. CIA debriefings from Eastern European refugees revealed a recurring theme. People did not speak because speaking had become pointless. They did not protest because protest had become ritualized failure. They were not convinced. They were worn down. This distinction mattered. Because systems built on belief resist pressure. Systems built on exhaustion collapse when pressure is removed. The KGB never truly understood this difference. In Hungary, after the war, Soviet control was imposed gradually. First, coalition governments, then infiltration, then purges. By 1956, the population had lived under nearly a decade of controlled reality. When the uprising began, it was not led by ideologues. It was led by students, workers, and veterans, people who had followed the rules, until the rules became unbearable. The KGB interpreted the Hungarian Revolution as a security failure. The CIA interpreted it as a psychological inevitability. After the tanks rolled in and the rebellion was crushed, Soviet leadership believed control had been restored. But something irreversible had happened. The illusion of unanimity was gone. In Poland, similar fractures emerged. Catholic identity persisted despite decades of repression. Labor movements formed despite surveillance. Truth survived through memory, not media. The KGB responded the same way every time. More informants, more files, more fear. By the 1960s, the Soviet Union employed millions of informants across the Eastern Bloc. Entire apartment buildings were compromised. A neighbor was not a neighbor. A coworker was not a coworker. Trust became dangerous. And here lies the paradox the KGB never solved. A system that destroys trust also destroys loyalty. CIA analysts noticed that repression was no longer producing belief. It was producing performance. People learned how to appear loyal. They repeated slogans without conviction. They attended meetings without listening. They voted without believing. The state had achieved obedience at the cost of sincerity. Inside the Soviet military, this contradiction became lethal. Officers memorized ideology, but quietly compared it to what they saw abroad. Border troops stationed near Western Europe observed something troubling. The enemy was not collapsing. Western cities functioned. Western citizens spoke freely. Western societies changed, but did not implode. This contradicted everything they had been taught. Political officers could discipline soldiers. They could not discipline perception. The KGB's solution was to tighten ideological enforcement. But enforcement cannot overwrite experience. Every soldier who crossed a border, every diplomat who traveled, every technician who saw Western equipment, returned with doubts. The CIA understood that these doubts did not need encouragement. They only needed space. By the late 1960s, the Soviet Union entered a period later described internally as stagnation. Not collapse, not crisis. Stagnation, the most dangerous state of all. Nothing moved forward. Nothing collapsed. People survived. Without hope. The KGB misread this stability as success. But CIA assessments concluded the opposite. The system was hollowing itself out. And hollow systems shatter suddenly. Nowhere was this more evident than in Czechoslovakia in 1968. The Prague Spring was not a counter-revolution. It was an attempt to make socialism tolerable. That terrified Moscow, because it implied that ideology needed permission from reality. When the invasion crushed reform, the lesson was clear. Truth would never be negotiated. From that moment forward, belief was no longer even expected. Only compliance. And compliance is temporary. The final blow to KGB confidence came from a place they could not control. Afghanistan, what was supposed to be a manageable intervention, became a bleeding wound. The war contradicted propaganda daily. Coffins returned silently. Veterans returned traumatized. Families were lied to. The KGB attempted suppression. But grief does not obey censorship. Internal reports warned of moral corrosion, not rebellion, corrosion. The system was dissolving internally. When Gorbachev introduced openness, the intent was repair. But systems built on fear cannot survive transparency. Once people were allowed to speak, they did not demand reform. They demanded honesty. And honesty destroyed the illusion the KGB had spent decades enforcing. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed, the KGB was still feared. But fear alone cannot hold a nation together. And that was the CIA's quiet victory, not by overthrowing the system, but by understanding its nature better than its creators ever did. While the Soviet Union obsessed over control, the United States approached the Cold War from a fundamentally different psychological position. American intelligence did not begin with the question, how do we silence our opponent? It began with a far more dangerous one. What happens if people are allowed to choose? This difference shaped everything. The CIA was not free of fear. It was not free of mistakes. But it operated within a system that assumed legitimacy came from consent, not coercion. That assumption changed how power was used. In the late 1940s, American policymakers understood something deeply unsettling. The United States could not defeat the Soviet Union by force without destroying the world. Nuclear parity made direct confrontation suicidal. So the battlefield had to be elsewhere, inside the human mind. The CIA's earliest Cold War strategists were not soldiers. They were sociologists, psychologists, historians, linguists. They studied empires that collapsed not from invasion, but from internal contradiction. They studied Rome. They studied Tsarist Russia. They studied authoritarian systems that mistook silence for stability. One conclusion appeared again and again. Closed systems rot quietly. Open systems adapt. The American strategy was therefore indirect by design. It did not seek to humiliate the Soviet Union publicly. It did not seek to provoke mass uprising. That would have triggered repression and strengthened hardliners. Instead, it sought comparison without confrontation. American intelligence understood that truth did not need amplification. It needed consistency. Facts repeated calmly become anchors. Anchors survive propaganda storms. The CIA's psychological doctrine emphasized patience. Years, not months. Generations, not elections. While the KGB demanded ideological obedience, the CIA focused on credibility. If American messages contradicted reality, they would fail. So reality became the weapon. American institutions emphasized procedural stability, free debate, predictable change, visible disagreement. These were not weaknesses. They were proof. To authoritarian systems, disagreement looks like chaos. To populations living under enforced unanimity, it looks like honesty. CIA analysts observed that Soviet propaganda constantly shifted narratives. Enemies changed. Statistics changed. Explanations evolved to fit failures. This inconsistency mattered. People living under authoritarianism develop an acute sensitivity to contradiction. The CIA did not invent counter-narratives. It allowed Soviet narratives to collapse under their own weight. The contrast became unbearable. Internally, American intelligence faced a paradox. How do you fight a secret war without becoming what you oppose? The answer was restraint. Not moral purity, restraint. The CIA did not attempt to control every outcome. It accepted uncertainty. This was incomprehensible to the KGB. To Soviet intelligence, lack of control meant failure. To American intelligence, lack of total control meant resilience. In Eastern Europe, this difference became visible over decades. When protests occurred, American responses were cautious. No tanks, no invasions, just observation. The KGB misinterpreted restraint as weakness, but restraint preserved legitimacy. By the 1970s, the American approach had matured into something more powerful. The CIA understood that authoritarian systems suffer from information overload at the top. Too many reports, too many lies, too much filtering. Leaders stop hearing reality. Meanwhile, open societies generate noise but also correction. Errors are exposed quickly. Failures are debated. This creates pain but also adaptation. Soviet leadership increasingly operated inside echo chambers. The CIA quietly benefited from openness. Every Soviet defector, every intercepted document, every internal report confirmed the same thing. The system was blind to itself. American intelligence did not need to push. It only needed to wait. When crises emerged, economic stagnation, technological lag, demographic decline, the Soviet system could not respond honestly. Admitting failure threatened legitimacy, so failure was denied. The CIA tracked these contradictions meticulously, not for propaganda, for timing. By the time reforms were attempted, they arrived too late. The system could not metabolize truth without collapsing. And collapse came not through conquest, but through exposure. This was not a victory of arrogance. It was a victory of structure. The CIA did not defeat the KGB by outspying it. It defeated it by understanding how power actually survives. By the late stages of the Cold War, the conflict between the CIA and the KGB was no longer theoretical. It was no longer ideological. It was operational. Both sides had spent decades studying one another. Both believed they understood the enemy. Only one of them was correct. The KGB entered the final phase of the Cold War convinced of its own superiority. It believed the West was morally weak, politically divided, and culturally decaying. It believed democracy produced indecision, that openness created vulnerability, that freedom would eventually destroy itself. This belief shaped every major miscalculation that followed. The CIA, by contrast, had reached a far less dramatic conclusion. The Soviet system was not about to collapse dramatically. It was about to fail quietly, and quiet failure is far harder to detect from the inside. Throughout the 1970s, the KGB doubled down on what it knew. More counterintelligence, more internal surveillance, more ideological enforcement. Instead of adapting, it intensified. This created blind spots. The first critical failure emerged in how the KGB understood loyalty. To the KGB, loyalty was external. It could be measured by attendance, language, conformity, silence. The CIA understood loyalty differently. It understood that true loyalty is internal, and therefore invisible. This difference proved fatal. One of the most damaging blows to the KGB did not come from technology, or from sabotage, or even from espionage brilliance. It came from misplaced trust. Over and over again, Soviet intelligence assumed that ideological alignment guaranteed reliability. It did not. Men and women raised inside the Soviet system, educated by it, rewarded by it, began to defect not because they loved America, but because the Soviet explanation of reality collapsed. CIA debriefings reveal a chilling pattern. Defectors did not describe hatred. They described disappointment. They did not flee persecution. They fled absurdity. The KGB interpreted defections as individual failures. The CIA interpreted them as systemic symptoms. Each defection exposed another layer of internal decay. The KGB responded by increasing paranoia. But paranoia does not produce clarity, produces noise. Inside Soviet intelligence headquarters, reports multiplied. Warnings contradicted one another. Officers filtered information upward, telling superiors what they wanted to hear. Reality became distorted by fear. The CIA exploited this without touching it. American intelligence understood that authoritarian hierarchies collapse under bad information. You cannot correct what you cannot admit. By the 1980s, the KGB faced a crisis it could not name. It had immense power, but diminishing understanding. Meanwhile, American institutions absorbed criticism publicly. Failures were debated openly. Mistakes were exposed. This visibility, which the KGB saw as weakness, was in fact adaptation in action. The contrast became impossible to ignore. When crises erupted, economic decline, technological inferiority, demographic stagnation, the Soviet system could not respond truthfully. Truth threatened legitimacy, so legitimacy was protected at the expense of survival. The CIA tracked these contradictions with precision, not to accelerate collapse, to avoid interfering with it. This restraint mattered. The Soviet Union did not fall because it was attacked. It fell because it was revealed to itself. When reforms finally arrived, they were catastrophic not because they went too far, but because they came too late. Once truth entered the system, it did not reform it. It dissolved it. The KGB, designed to eliminate ambiguity, was suddenly forced to operate in a world filled with it. It had no doctrine for uncertainty. Fear lost its power. Files meant nothing when belief disappeared. By the time the Soviet Union officially collapsed, the KGB still existed. Its offices remained. Its officers reported for duty, but its authority was gone. No one believed anymore, and belief is the foundation of power. The CIA did not win by destroying the KGB. It won by outlasting it, by understanding something the KGB never did. Control can enforce silence, but only legitimacy sustains systems. The Cold War did not end with an explosion. It ended with a realization that systems built on fear eventually collapse under their own weight, and that freedom, though chaotic, possesses something control never will: the ability to correct itself. The Cold War did not end with victory parades. There were no surrender documents signed by the KGB, no final broadcast admitting defeat, no moment of acknowledgement, because the true defeat was internal. The Soviet Union did not lose because America was stronger. It lost because it stopped believing its own explanations of reality. The KGB was built to control people, but it never learned how to understand them. The CIA did not win by dominating the enemy. It won by trusting something far more dangerous to authoritarian systems: time. Time to expose contradictions. Time to let truth surface. Time for silence to stop working. In the end, fear could enforce obedience, but it could not inspire loyalty. And systems that rely on fear eventually collapse under their own weight. This was not the loudest victory in American history, but it may have been the most decisive, because it proved a lesson that still matters today. Freedom does not need to shout. It only needs to endure.